Hi there. In today's demonstration, I'm going to show you how you can use Power Automate and adaptive cards to collect data from attendees of a meeting prior to that meeting starting. So my particular scenario is based on a daily stand-up where we ask everyone what they did yesterday, what they have planned for today, and of course, are there any blockers? So 15 minutes prior to the meeting starting, we're going to fire out this adaptive card, collect this information, and then summarize it in an HTML table in our Teams chat. Not only that, I'm going to save it to a SharePoint list, and that will hopefully give our Scrum Master or Project Manager the information they need in order to plan ahead for that day. So if that's something that interests you, please make sure you watch on, and if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe. So without further ado, let's jump into my demonstration. So here we are in Microsoft Teams, and you can see here I have my daily recurring meeting at 9 o'clock. It's my daily stand-up. And if I go into that particular meeting and we'll just go and edit that occurrence, you can see that I'm the organizer and I have 4 potential attendees. So we're going to fire out our adaptive card to all 5 of us, ask everyone what they're up to, and they have 10 minutes to respond in order to then summarize that data on our Teams chat. So I'm going to jump into my flow now, and I'm not going to go into any detail at this point. I'm actually going to go ahead and test it and show you the solution, and then we can walk through it in more detail if that's something that interests you. But it's all based on a recurrence trigger. It runs at 8:45. Of course, my meeting's at 9 o'clock. There will be a 10-minute timeout at some point in this flow so that everyone that's responded within 10 minutes will be included as part of that summary. If you don't respond, you'll simply be marked as no response. So I'm going to go ahead and hit test, go into manual, and this is going to fire out adaptive cards to everyone that's part of that list. So if I jump into my Teams, I've given myself a minute to do this. You can see that I have my response here. So I'm going to say that yesterday I was working on Project C. Today I am studying. And blockers, I have none that I am aware of. And I'm going to hit send response. And then I'm going to bring up my colleague. And they've been asked the same thing with their adaptive card. So they're working on Project A. Today they are studying, and blockers I'm going to leave as empty. And then finally I've got my last colleague, and they were on holiday. They're going to be working with Jamie today, and their blockers, again, they're going to leave as empty. I'm going to send that response, and I'm going to jump back across to my flow. So you can see here the apply to each we've got is still running, but I expect this to time out. This would be normally set at 10 minutes, but I've set it to a minute for the purpose of this demonstration, so we're not hanging about. And you can see it's got to the end and it's posted a message. So what that should mean is if I go back into Teams and go into my daily stand-up chat, I now have my pre-stand-up summary. So you can see here, Alex Wilbur has responded, and also Henrietta has responded, but then Dave and Lynn have given no response, and finally myself, I can see here that I am working on Project C, studying, and I have no blockers. So this is what we're going to look at. How did I achieve this? And also, just for the purpose of the demonstration, I have also submitted all this data into a SharePoint list. So if an HTML table is not something you're looking for, or maybe you want a bit of both, this is also available to you as part of the solution. Right, so how did this all work? So if I go into edit mode, and we'll walk through the flow first of all. It's all based on a recurrence trigger. So at 8:45 every day, my meeting's at 9 o'clock, I'm going to send everyone an adaptive card asking them that question. Then I've got a condition in here, which is currently incorrectly set, so that it would run because today is a Saturday. It should be set as or, because I want to check that the day of the week is equal to 0 or 6. And if it is, which is a Saturday or Sunday, I want it to terminate, because of course my daily stand-ups are Monday to Friday and don't include Saturday to Sunday. So if this condition is not met and we don't branch left, we branch right down the yes, we can then continue with our flow. And so the first thing that I'm doing is I'm getting the details of this particular calendar event using the get event action. So that get event action is requiring an event ID, and I can simply get that from my calendar as the owner. So if I open up my calendar and go into edit occurrence, you'll see at the top here there is a parameter event ID, and all I simply do is highlight that event ID all the way up to the ampersand prior to conversation ID, copy that and paste that into my action. And so that'll allow me to retrieve the attendees and well, an awful lot of information that I don't require, but this is how I've decided to bring together a list of attendees. Then I have a compose action, and something you'll notice throughout my actions is that I have the expressions in the comments. So if it's something you want to copy, you can pause the video at any point and take a look at the expressions in more detail. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the concat expression to bring together the required attendees and also the organizer, which was myself. So you remember when I fired up the initial calendar entry, I had 4 attendees and I was the organizer. So I concat the 2 of them, and then I'm using the split expression to split on a semicolon. And so what that'll give me is an array of email addresses. Moving on to the next step, we have an apply to each. So the apply to each relies on our array of email addresses. And what it will do is it will send an adaptive card to everyone individually based on that array. And you can see here I have my adaptive card payload. And you're probably looking at this and thinking, this looks pretty complex. Well, not to worry, because the JSON payload that I've inserted here is all based on a designer online, which I'll show you in a second. We'll just quickly talk through this action and then I'll jump into that designer. So I'm posting as a flowbot. I'm posting in a chat with the flowbot. You can see I have the JSON payload, which is the designer of the adaptive card. I have an update message, which is basically what the end user gets when they've submitted their response, and it's just the date, time with stand-up note sent. And then the recipient is all based on the current item. I've also set a timeout on this. So if we go into the ellipsis and settings, you'll see here I've set it as a 1-minute timeout. So if this is real life, you might want to give everyone 10 minutes to respond prior to the meeting starting. Now, if we want to look at the adaptive card, there is a website, adaptivecards.io, and there are samples and a designer. And you'll see this adaptive card sample we have here looks extremely familiar. It's because I have copied my payload from that action in my flow into the editor here, and that will then demonstrate what my adaptive card will in theory look like. But you can see down the left hand side you have all your various elements that you can just pull across and drag and drop. You can set all the various parameters for them, and you can build your own adaptive card relatively easy. There are also samples, so if there's a specific card that you're looking for, you can maybe copy and try from the samples. So moving back to our flow, each person that responds will generate a body response, but for those that don't respond and the action times out, I actually have a bespoke compose action here with a sample body. So what I did initially was I ran this action, I looked at the body response, I copied and pasted it into a compose action, and then I completed some of the key values. So the display name was one of the values. That usually returns a name. I've used the email address based on this apply to each. And then for the data, for yesterday, today, and blockers, I've simply put the string no response, no response, no response. And the reason for me building this out is that I then use quite a clever little expression, or a useful little expression known as coalesce. So coalesce will return from a list of values the first non-null value. So you'll see that I have 2 values. I have the body of the response and then my fallback response from above. And what this basically means is if someone has responded will set the user response to the body, and if they haven't responded, i.e. this value that I've highlighted here is null, then we will use my fallback response. This is not something you necessarily have to implement yourself, but I preferred to have the email address and the values no response if someone hasn't responded. And the other thing to note, if we go into the ellipsis here and into settings, you'll see that this is not where I wanted to go. It was in fact the ellipsis and configure run after. As well as is successful, we have has timed out, because of course this action above could time out if the 10 minutes is exceeded, and therefore we want this to continue running based on a timeout. So this applies to each post an adaptive card, it creates a fallback response, and then using coalesce, it either chooses the response that someone's given or our fallback response. Outside of this apply to each, we're then using Peter's method again, which allows us to bring together all of the individual composed user responses into an array. And all that simply does is it looks at this compose action here and it brings all these objects together to create us a nice array. And this is all without having to use variables. Now that you have an array of responses, we can use the select action, and that select action allows us to repurpose that data with our new key value pairs. So you'll see here I have user, yesterday, today, and blockers, and it's these values that I'm using for my HTML table. So again, I have the expressions in the comments here. The user is straightforward in that it's just based on the responder display name, but yesterday, today, and blockers, because potentially someone could leave that blank, I've got the default value of n/a. So if someone has submitted a response but left that response empty, I will replace it with n/a. And if they have submitted a response, I'm using the replace expression, which will replace any return values with a double return. Now the reason I'm doing that is I discovered that when capturing data from adaptive cards, if someone's inserted a return and then you want that return to feature in your HTML table, you need to double up your returns. Again, I'll leave that to you to explore, but for my purpose and my testing, this worked for me. Equally, you could just have the individual values for yesterday, today, and blockers. Creating an HTML table, there are the advanced options, but because I have created a nicely purposed array now with just the columns that I'm requiring, all I need to do is insert that output from the select and don't have to worry about using the manual method. And that now creates our lovely HTML table that we use in our last action. And equally for our apply to each to create items, again, because we have our select action, I've supplied that select value into the input of our apply to each, inserted the create item action, and then I am able to supply the user, yesterday, today, and blockers value to the create items action. And as I mentioned a second ago, our final action is posting a message in a chat or a channel. And I have the format date time with the pre-stand-up summary as the header, and then simply supplying that HTML table that if I jump onto my chat, we see here. So some of the things that I mentioned as part of that walk through the flow, you saw there that there was no response given for blockers, so it's replaced the no response for NA. You can see that there are a couple of people here that didn't even get back to us. So rather than showing the names, it's actually showing their email addresses, because it's the email addresses that I retrieve from the calendar required attendees. And I use that fallback response and supply no response, no response, no response. I've not got any examples, unfortunately, of return lines in this, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what is potentially possible using the adaptive cards. If I go quickly into the history, we'll just jump back and jump into that history. There's maybe some of the things we can have a look at. The list of the emails here, you can see, is an array of email addresses. That was based, of course, on the get events. If we look at the apply to each, you can see that we have a response here from one of our users. If I go on to my next and next again, so here we had a timeout where we had the fallback response. Now the fallback response is populated for everyone, but if we look at the user response, you can see that it's chosen the fallback response because it wasn't empty, whereas obviously the response from post an adaptive card was empty or null because it timed out. If we look at the user responses, and we'll just expand that quickly, that's a huge array of objects of everyone's response. There we go. And if we have our look at our select, we've taken that huge array of user responses, and again, if I expand that, we've created a nice, neat array of user, yesterday, today, and blockers. And that's what makes our HTML table a lot easier. When it comes to creating items, that's straightforward. It's just taking the data from that select, nothing to see there, and of course our post message to the chat or channel. So that marks the end of my demonstration. Hopefully it was a slightly different order from things. I did the demonstration first and then the walkthrough after. If there's anything you have questions about, please feel free to drop me a message below. But hopefully it inspires you to use adaptive cards. It's a great way of collecting data from a list or group of people. Of course, you can implement a timeout to bring that information together, maybe after a period of time, a day, 2 days, if you're doing a survey or something. But for my particular example for meetings, within 10 minutes, and it gives us a nice, quick, concise response of information in our channel ready for our meeting 5 minutes later. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and hopefully see you again soon. Cheers, bye.